Okay, I think we're all here now. Yeah. Okay, so hello and welcome to this Anne Lister Research Summit session, where we're going to explore and talk a little bit about Anne Lister and her penchant for climbing mountains. So just to introduce Marlene and I, we're both independent researchers and we were both Anne Lister codebreakers as part of the transcription project. We both began by voluntarily transcribing Anne Lister's journals, and then we started digging into the history of female mountaineering when we discovered that Anne Lister had been quite an accomplished traveller and climber of mountains. So first of all, we'll start with a little bit about who Anne Lister was. Many of you here will probably already know a great deal about who Anne Lister was. But one thing that's not particularly widely known about her is that she was an accomplished mountaineer. So if you have heard of her, you have heard of her in the context of her famous diary and as a woman who had relationships with other women. But lesser known is that she was the first tourist to summit Malvignemal in the Pyrenees in 1838. This achievement was largely forgotten until in the late 1960s, Vivian Ingham, who was a Lister historian, published work that brought this to light. Oh, I think I hear a dog barking. It was only once this work was published that Anne Lister was positively recognised when a pass on the Vignemale was actually named after her, which is now called Col Lady Lister. But Anne Lister's mountaineering achievements aren't only limited to Vignemale, as we shall see. So just to set the scene a little bit about mountaineering in the 19th century, it was becoming increasingly more common for mountaineers or people to explore mountain regions in search of glory and adventure, to be the first person to reach that place, or, in the name of science and discovery. Other people simply just wanted to explore these once forbidden landscapes in the name of the beauty of it and wanting to write about their experiences. However, it's clear that a lot of this activity was for the people who could afford to travel to those places and the costs incurred by doing so. And obviously, traveling far afield in those days meant that you would have quite long travel times in sort of really uncomfortable environments like carriages and on horseback. Climbing mountains, obviously, today is incredibly dangerous. And you can probably imagine in the 19th century, it was even more dangerous because we didn't have the equipment required to do so. So it was for people who were willing to risk it all for a new landscape. So despite the social expectations of domesticity placed on women at this time, perhaps surprisingly, a few women did defy social norms and achieve notable feats in mountaineering. Some of these women were relatively well known and are relatively well known now, such as Henrietta d'Angeville and Lucy Walker, who became more famous towards the end of the 19th century. But there were others whose feats disappeared into obscurity, such as the Mrs. and Miss Campbell, a Scottish mother and daughter duo who climbed Mont Blanc in the 1830s after a few failed attempts earlier in the 1820s, but very little is known about them, including their first names. Which is a shame because it's an incredible achievement to have summited Mont Blanc at that time. Anne Lister was also interested in climbing Mont Blanc, but unfortunately, due to poor weather conditions in 1827, she wasn't able to do this. But if the weather conditions had been good, it's likely that she would have attempted this before Henrietta d'Angeville successfully climbed it in 1838. So a little bit more about Anne's mountaineering excursions. So the reason we know so much about Anne Lister's mountaineering is because of her journals. I mean, that's how we know most of the things that we know about Anne, is because she wrote so much. She noted the extreme detail about everything: what she ate, who she met, what time she woke up, what time she went to bed each day, the temperature, the weather, her business deals, and of course, the more salacious accounts of her relationships. These journals consist of 27 volumes spanning around 34 years. And Lister kept travel journals and correspondence. With the help of other transcribers, we were able to gather Anne's written accounts of 11 completed climbs, that she did, 3 intended climbs that she was unfortunately not able to complete, and various hikes and scrambles. In one case, we rely on the journal of her partner, Anne Walker, because Anne Lister was haphazard sometimes and neglected to write her travels, believe it or not. When she did write them, her mountaineering excursions were documented in meticulous detail, as you can imagine, and there's far too much for us to cover today, but we're going to look at a few of these. Slide, please. Thank you. So something that becomes apparent about Anne Lister is that she was an incredibly active woman. She often walked miles, not only as a means of travel, but also because she enjoyed the physical activity of exercise, walking as exercise, and she kept herself fairly fit. She documented many early excursions of hill walking and climbing. These included Mount Snowdon in 1822, the 3 Yorkshire Peaks in 1823, and excursions in the Swiss Alps in 1827 and 1834. She climbed the highest peak in the British Isles, Ben Nevis, in 1828, reaching the summit after 4.5 hours of very fatiguing climbing and suffering from extreme thirst. As we charted these achievements through the journals and we started picking out the details of these climbs that she completed, we began to see a pattern emerging that as the years increased, with the more climbs that she had completed, they were beginning to become sort of higher and more further afield. So it sort of became apparent that Lister's appetite for more higher, difficult climbing was increasing as the years progressed. Slide, please. So in the 1830s, she set her sights on Mount Perdue in the Pyrenees. While traveling there with friends, she prepared for this climb by ordering a set of crampons and by climbing other smaller mountains in the region. She also hired a guide whose name is Jean-Pierre Charles, who we'll later see in another climb that she was famous for. On the 24th of August, Lister set off with a small group and separated from her main party of friends, and they headed for the Brec de Roland, which is a rocky gap that you have to pass in order to reach Mount Perdue. So after crossing this gap using crampons and icy steps that her guides had to cut into the glacier so that they could cross, they spent the night in a cabin, rested a bit, and then woke early the next morning. So Mount Perdue stands at 3,352 meters, and the party set off by candlelight at 3 a.m. Not the best time to be climbing a mountain, but I'm sure they had very good reason, on the 26th of August. Lister wrote that she was fatigued, climbing across shingle ground with very little light. And as the sun came up, they were able to scale the rock face. The party continued along the crater, battling against the wind, and even the unflappable Lister confessed that this was very difficult climbing. They reached the snowy summit around 8 a.m, but on returning to her friends, Anne said that she did not mean to say much about this, for it was not quite a ladies' expedition. It was generally not the done thing for ladies to be out climbing mountains. We were fortunate enough to have access to the Journal of Anne Walker, which Marlene kindly transcribed for us, and we were able to use this to add some details to the climbs that we knew Anne Lister had already completed, and some that we knew Anne Lister and Anne Walker had completed together. But Anne Walker's journal also gave us some information about totally new climbs that were not documented in Anne Lister's journal, and La Brevin in the Alps is one such mountain. The quote on this slide is all that Anne Walker wrote about this excursion, and it appears that Lister continued on further up the mountain while Anne Walker took a break and had a bit of a rest. So it's unclear whether or not Anne Lister actually made it to the summit or not, but we know that they definitely got mountain souvenirs to take home, which is very important. So in 1838, Lister returned to the Pyrenees, this time with Anne Walker, and she began reading about the summit of Malvignemal, which is the highest mountain in the French Pyrenees, and it straddles the French-Spanish border. And at this time, it was thought to be inaccessible from the French side. Nobody had actually climbed it from that side, although it had been climbed from the other side, from the Spanish border. Anne consulted guides. She knew of, she consulted like a local guide who knew of a potential route, and his name was Henri Cazot, or Henri Cazot. My French pronunciation is not very good. As well as Jean-Pierre Charles, whom she climbed Mount Perdue with in 1830. So she brought him back for another chance at climbing a mountain. So having agreed to a fair price and agreeing a date with Cazot, the trek for the summit began on the evening of the 6th of August. Anne and her party of guides spent the night in a nearby cabin at the base of the summit, at the base of the mountain, beg your pardon. And they set off at 3 a.m. Again, very little light, 3 o'clock in the morning. And by 7 a.m., they climbed to the chimney and reached the snowy, icy glacier around 8 a.m., where they put on crampons to cross. During a break, Lister wrote that she felt unwell and was actually sick on the mountainside, but she was still very determined. Around 1 p.m., they finally reached the summit, where Lister prepared a small bottle to leave at the top containing a note with a date, the date that they had gone, her name, and those names of her guides as well. So very exciting day, an amazing achievement. But days later, Lister heard the news that one of her guides had deceived her. Cazot was said to have confirmed to another person who was looking to climb the Vignemale from the French side, the Prince de la Moscow. He confirmed to him that he was actually the first person to have climbed the summit, and that Anne Lister had actually fell ill and hadn't made it to the top. So when Anne heard about this, she was not pleased, as you can imagine. She went to a lawyer, as you do, in Lourdes, who wrote out a certificate that was then presented to Cazot, and Anne had him sign it. The document attested that Anne Lister and her guides reached the summit of the Vignemale on the 7th of August, 1838, and that was days before the prince did. Cazot did apologise and explained that he had intentionally fooled the prince in order to get his full payment, which is very naughty. He signed the document, and the prince was informed that Lister had indeed beaten him to the summit, which I'm sure he was thrilled to hear. But unfortunately, a local newspaper had already published the prince's achievement. So Anne Lister, being Anne Lister, wrote a note to the newspaper to issue a correction, which was then published. But despite all these efforts, Lister's climb was still overlooked. The Prince de la Moscow published a book about his climb, which made no mention of Anne Lister at all, or her successful climb either. Written out of history. Lister's climb of Vignemale was mentioned in a handful of other books in the 1800s, but it wasn't until the 1960s that the successful ascent of Anne Lister would be properly recognised, when a Pyrenean historian, Luc Murray, and Lister historian, Vivian Ingham, got together and finally published some of Anne's own journals that described her own ascent of the mountain. And Marlene will go into this a little bit more later on in this presentation. So Vignemale is the pinnacle of Lister's mountaineering achievements. However, she did have even higher climbs in mind. One example of this is Mount Ararat in Turkey, which is actually a volcano, and is probably more famous for being the supposed site of Noah's Ark. I don't know if that's what motivated Anne to want to climb it. I have no idea. But yeah, she wanted to climb a volcano because why not? So Anne did investigate the potential of being able to climb this in 1840. She did look for guides. She read books in preparation. But unfortunately, due to changes in her travel plans with Anne Walker, this was never attempted. And it's probably just as well, because in July 1840, there was a massive eruption and earthquake in that region and resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. So she's probably maybe dodged a bullet temporarily, but she did unfortunately die later that year. So who knows? So yeah. Now, Marlene will explain a little bit more about how Lister prepared for her climbs and the legacy of her achievements and what that means to us today.
All right, so we've discussed some of Anne's climbs. Now let's have a brief look at how she prepared. So one of the first steps was to hire local guides, but not just any guide, preferably a mountain guide who had done climbs with other people, successful climbs preferably, because they know terrain, they know all the weather, and all that stuff can change in a minute in the mountains. So experience in mountaineering is important. Even today in modern expeditions, you always want to have someone who is an experienced mountain guide, because there are safety reasons, and also knowing terrain is obviously very important. In Anne Lister's case, she had several guides for each ascent, but the two who are probably more high profile are Henri Cazot from the Vignemale expedition in 1838. He had climbed the mountain in 1837 with a partner. And they are credited with finding the first route to the summit from the French side, which at the time was quite something. Then when Anne Lister was considering the climb of Mount Ararat in modern-day Turkey, and in her time it was Armenia, she talked with a man named Kashatura Bovian, whom she didn't know much about, but Bovian had been one of the climbing partners of Professor Parrot, who did the first successful ascent of Mount Ararat. So he was experienced, but there's another layer to this, because Bovian was also somewhat of a scholar and a poet. So he's credited as the father of modern Armenian literature, which is funny because Anne Lister had no idea who he was. She even misspelled his name and kind of went over her head, and then at some point they lost touch, and she eventually gave up on the expedition in favor of other excursions with Anne Walker. So there you have it. Anne Lister actually met the so-called father of modern Armenian literature. Another important thing Anne Lister does is to read travel guides and books that include either mentions of mountaineering expeditions or just basic excursions in the area, both for her own curiosity and because she liked to be prepared, or sometimes she wants to see specific stuff. And it helps to have actually a guide at hand that you can follow. Two examples of this are Chauzin's book and Charpentier's book, especially for the Vignemale climb in 1838. She not only uses them as travel guides, but when she's learning about the Mount Vignemale, those are very important books that she can actually follow. Coming up to another thing she did, especially important in the Mont Perdue and Vignemale climbs, are acquiring gear and adapting their clothing. The gear especially is very important, because when you are crossing certain areas in the mountain, you need specialized gear like bâton ferré, walking sticks, and crampons. A funny story about crampons. She bought her own crampons for Mont Perdue, but then in 1838 she was a bit reticent in bringing them to Vignemale, and Anne Walker was the one who convinced her to actually bring them along. And then in the end, she really benefited from that, because she had to cross the ice to the summit of Mont Vignemale, so it was an advantage. In terms of adapting their clothing, she uses a system of loops and strings to get her dress closer to her body before she climbs Mont Vignemale. The clear advantage is she can walk and enjoy more freedom of movement without having her clothing being an issue or causing any safety issues. Finally, another thing she does is travel light, which means she only brings the essentials for that specific climb or tour that involves the climb and not much else. So moving on, what motivated Lister to try these things that so often engaged, put her physical prowess to the test? What's her motivation? Is it the fame, the thrill of the adventure, or something else entirely? Let's see what she has to say. So in 1838, when she's trying to prove that she climbed Mount Vignemale, she remarks to her journal that nobody believes she climbed Mount Perdue. So she obviously climbed that and she knew she had done it, but the people to whom she confessed she had done it didn't believe her. So after she writes this down, she goes into this quote that you guys can see now, and she reflects on motivation. What mattered it to me? I made each ascent for my own pleasure, not for eclat. What is eclat to me? What is eclat to anyone? Too often, a dangerous bauble, the lightning forked flash that kills the object it has fixed on. So she does that because she likes it, not necessarily for a competition, but because it's something she actually enjoys. So when someone says you didn't do that, she obviously is not super happy about it. Let's see, now about their legacy. As you know, Anne Lister died at Kutaisi in Georgia in 1840. So let's now have a look at how things evolved after her death. Anne Lister almost accidentally got her legacy lost to history. First, because she didn't always write down things in the journal right after they happened. So the Vignemale climb is a good example. The blank pages start barely after she wrote it down, so she almost erased herself accidentally. Then in September of 1838, while she was still about the Pyrenees with Anne Walker, the Prince de la Moscow published an account of his ascent in a French journal of sorts called the Revue des Monde. Sorry, I'm not French enough. And in 1842, he published a book about his climb of Mount Vignemale. So by 1842, he had 2 publications plus a newspaper article saying, I did this, I'm the first. It wasn't, but to the public opinion, that is not very relevant. So in 1854, Anne Lister's climb starts to show up in some publications. When Vincent de Chausenc publishes his book about the travels in the Pyrenees, and he, for that book, had to interview Jean-Pierre Charles, who had been Anne Lister's guide for Mont Perdue and Vignemale, and also he had been years before Vincent de Chausenc's guide. And Charles still remembers Anne Lister, and he still regards her as an impressive woman. In fact, he remembers her and then Walker as brave women, and he remarks about Anne Lister as someone showing a superlative courage for a woman, which might sound patronizing in modern terms, but for a mountain guide in a mainly masculine sport, this is actually very impressive to have someone who did some of these climbs describing her like this. So at the start of the 20th century, a man named Henri Beraldi is publishing a series of books about the history of the Pyrenees. And in that book, he has an extract from an oral history of Henri Cazot's son, who is by then an octogenarian. And they too apparently either saw or met Anne Lister at some point, and he remembers her as a superb woman. So she clearly left a mark in the Pyrenees, and she was reminded as quite the figure among the people who lived there. And then in the 1960s, Vivian Ingham was working on her thesis about Anne Lister. And that's when the story starts to emerge from the journals because Vivian Ingham worked directly with the journals. After some time, she decided to travel to the Pyrenees to learn more about the locations that I visited and the guides of the Pyrenees. Because if now it's hard to get some information from the French side, back then, as you can imagine, it must be even worse. So she had to go there, and she did. And there she met a notary / mountaineer named Pierre Verger Lacoste. Mr. Lacoste also was interested in the history of the Pyrenees, and he lent her several books about that. Then, after she got back to England, Luke Murray was a man studying, was like the history of the Pyrenees, visited Mr. Lacoste, and he learned about Vivian Ingham and eventually got in touch with her. So Murray and Ingham, among several others, created a sort of a chain that passed knowledge, and they agreed to do successive publications, both in France and in England. And Murray and Ingham actually intended to meet in person, but Ingham got sick and she died in January of 1969, leaving only 2 published articles about Dan's conquest of Vignemale, one in the Alpine Journal, another one published and read posthumously to the Halifax Antiquarian Society. Murray continued to study Lister's climb of the Vignemale, and he published a book about a ascent of the Vignemale, and also some smaller articles in local history publications. If you're curious about the book, this is an edition of the book, one of the first editions. It's relatively common, from the 2000 and something. But there's a new edition which you can find online. There's only a small note. It's written totally in French, so you need to be a bit French enough to go over it. Now, moving on to Anne's legacy. Okay, so, but all this, why is it important to have this information from Anne Lister's point of view? Well, first, this is a female mountaineer's history told in her own words. If you've studied some of this, you can find many accounts from other people's point of view, but it's not very often that you find someone's mountaineering experience in such detail. So Anne Lister is special in this regard, even though sometimes we have to be a bit unorthodox while gathering information to get their context. So aside from that, Anne is also permanently associated with the history of the Pyrenees, because her conquest of Vignemale is obviously of historical importance, and if it's so for us here, it must be even more for the people who actually studied the local history of the Pyrenean area, because she got her name with the greats of mountaineering in Pyrenees. So she also got an interesting privilege, which is to have a mountain pass named after her, which you can see in that photo. In front of you, you'll see the Pic Central, which is the next incline in front of you. Then there's a little decline in the middle, and that's the pass, which is called Col Lady Lister, in honor of Anne Lister, allegedly. And the Via de la Moscawa, which is the red one with the arrow, named after the Prince de la Moscawa. Ironically, she will have her name permanently above his in the Vignemale, which is a funny thing and well-deserved. Okay, so finally, what else can she do? Well, she can inspire more people to follow in her footsteps and take over mountaineering, take up mountaineering as a sport, because as strange as it might seem, the sport is still mostly a masculine thing. So the more women we can get to that sport, the better, and she did this. She did inspire people in the past. Hopefully, she will inspire more people in the future. So this is a nice legacy to have. And now we move on to Q&A. Oh dear, you guys have questions. Okay. So, Leah, would you like to unmute yourself?
I was just wondering if you know of any other women at the time who did serious mountaineering.
Yes, Amanda, would you like to take this?
Yeah, so there were a handful. I think it depends what you mean by serious mountaineering, but there were a couple of women. There was, in particular, the Campbells, which I mentioned, Mrs. and Miss Campbell, who are actually a bit of a mystery. It's not very much known about them, and that's something that I'm particularly interested in sort of looking into, because they did attempt to climb Mont Blanc in the 1820s and were unsuccessful. But according to Anne Lister, who Anne had heard of them, they were successful in the 1830s, and Anne does mention knowing about them and hearing about them in her journal. So that's something of interest. There was also Maria Paradis, who was a local woman who lived at a small village at the foot of Mont Blanc, and she did reach the top, but she was dragged by some of her guides. Say dragged. She was lifted, which was common with quite a lot of women who were climbing mountains then. They would employ lots and lots of guides to take them to the top of summits, but they wouldn't necessarily be doing it on their own steam. So they would be lifted or carried to the top. And I think something that's sort of unique about Anne Lister was that she made it on her own steam, because she had that athleticism in order to do that. So yeah, there's a handful. I hope that answers your question.
So there's a cool one in the chat. Are there any of these climbs that you would like to attempt yourself? So speaking for myself, if my legs would carry me up, I would like to do Ben Nevis, and maybe Mont Perdue and Vignemale.
I think if I was gonna start, I would start like Anne, start small, maybe with some hikes, and then maybe Snowdon, and try and build it up, because yeah, that seems to make more sense. I'm not going to go all in for Vignemale after nothing.
Okay, so what else? Let's see. This climb already. Anyone else has anything? Olivia, I know you have a question, but my answer for you about the mountaineering percentages come to our presentation for the women in sport, because we have a note for that, but I don't have it at hand, so I'll have to get back to you. All right.
Ilva mentioned that she wants to try Gusta next year. That's one of the climbs that Anne attempted or thought about doing in Norway, but didn't actually do it, unfortunately, due to bad weather.
Chantel has a cool question, which is, did you find out when she mentioned their interest in climbing serious mountains for the first time? Personally, when I started to transcribe and to go down that path in research, she already had climbed a lot of stuff. So basically I had to come to terms with what she was doing then, and then sort of backtrack. But I'm not sure, Amanda, do you want to give some input about that?
No, I personally haven't seen anything, not a specific statement that said, oh, I'm doing this for a specific reason. I think it was just a hobby and she enjoyed doing it. And I think once she had got that buzz of completing one, the appeal of another seemed like a decent thing to do. But I haven't personally transcribed anything about, like, apart from the statement that we showed in the presentation about doing it for her own pleasure. Nothing specific yet, but it's ongoing. We may find something.
All right. What else? Any indication she intended to reattempt the climbs she was unable to complete? from Livia. Well, Ararat was quite the thing. So the story of Ararat comes in Tiflis when she's there with Anne Walker in 1840. And it's kind of random because someone talks about Persia and then someone talks about Ararat and she wants to go to Yerevan. And then she's like, oh, but what about the mountain? Because someone talks about Professor Parrot. And one thing leads to another. She starts to investigate that. She meets a Bovian. And then they go to Baku, they come back. And she's like, we'll go to Kutaisi and the area around that. And then some months later, obviously, there's the earthquake. And I remember going carefully looking for the earthquake. And she's like, some days after, oh, there was a big earthquake near Yerevan. A lot of people, a lot of destruction. And then she shuts up completely. So if she ever went there, well, at least she lived long enough to decide not to go there because she died in Kutaisi. She had time to go and come back, but we'll see. As far as I've seen in that particular climb, she wanted to go, but then circumstances changed. So she doesn't get back to it unless to say there was an earthquake and that's it. So Susan, would you like to unmute yourself?
So I saw in the comments that somebody asked about like how she prepared herself, what she ate, what she drank before she went on these big, huge climbs. And I remember one of you all transcribing one of the climbs. She ate like a boiled egg or something like that. It was like she didn't even like prepare, like I'm going to be climbing up this mountain for hours and hours and hours, and just sort of like winged it.
Yeah, well, she does that. And for Vignemale, she had a little bit of bread, like a mouthful, and some boiled milk, which she then obviously felt sick, so that came back. Eventually, she climbed that thing, sleep deprived because she wanted to go right away, but the guys were like, no, it's too dark. Let's maybe not try that. And then they made her wait. She didn't sleep much, didn't eat much. The next day, she was in her perpetual mode of go. So she was very ready to climb the mountain, and they went, then they came back down. Eventually she ate something else after the climb. So she has a tendency to climb stuff without eating much or sleeping much, which is not very healthy, but you know, that's enlisted for you. At least she lived as long as she did.
But I mean, that just shows her constitution, right? I mean, none of us would be able to do that. We'd probably like, you know, pass out like a quarter of the way. I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but I mean, you know, I go to the gym and work out and whatever, but I still, there's no way in hell I would be able to like climb a mountain on, you know, some bread and some boiled milk.
Yeah,
Well,
I've often wondered if that was the reason why she was sick, because she was dehydrated because she hadn't taken enough before, and she had nothing in her system. So of course she was feeling dizzy and feeling nauseous at the same time. Yeah, I've often thought that myself.
And even in the Lake District, didn't she like hike for miles? Like even the guide, this young kid was like, oh my God, I can't even keep up with this woman. She's killing me.
Yeah, on very little food again.
Yeah, so it's just, I think she's amazing. I just think her, you know, her constitution and what she was able to accomplish.
I know, imagine if she had a decent meal.
That's what I'm saying. Mount Everest, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We've talked about Everest on occasion, and we both think she would be fool enough to try it, but then she would probably die in the way, so maybe that's not such a great idea. So
Exactly.
Kerstin has a cool one. She asks, do you think she would have been able to reach the top of Mont Blanc? I don't think so. It's really dangerous, and even totally lots of accomplished climbers run into difficulties. Well, she certainly wanted to try it, and the timing was more or less decent in 1834, but the weather was not good. So I would like to think that she would do everything to try. Probably she would be like a frozen corpse by then. But well, Amanda, would you like to add something to it?
What I think is interesting is that Henrietta D'Angeville did manage it in 1838, which is the same time that Lister was climbing Vignemale. So, I mean, it was possible, but I don't know is the question. I think she certainly would have tried. Whether she was successful or not, who knows?
Yeah, Jane has an interesting comment about altitude sickness. I have wondered about altitude sickness for Anne several times, because sometimes she sort of gets close to what you would call altitude sickness, but then I don't like to diagnose the dead, so I can't really say if it's one or the other. So basically, I would like to think that maybe, but this is opinion based. So as far as I know, they didn't go as far to say, oh, she has altitude sickness. It's an interesting concept. Probably she might have suffered some of it, but I don't think we have enough data to say that for sure. All right. Anyone else has a question? Oh, Jane, you have your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, it was just into response to what you were saying about the altitude sickness. It's just that she wrote so much about food in her diary, you know, satisfactory mutton or not, and all that. So it kind of, and the amount of preparation that she did before walking, it feels like there would be a reason for her to, because it's something that seems to be common within her walking. And I know from my years of mountaineering that you tend to learn what works for you, and then you tend to repeat that. So you tend to have the kind of equipment that you know works for you, the levels of layers that you need, and also the food and the rations. And when you're planning, you weigh out, or you consider what you're taking with you as opposed to equipment, to food, to hydration, and everything like that. And because she's a smart woman, it's not like this was new to her. I just wonder, we can't know, but it seems like there might have been a reason for her to be doing it the way she did it.
Yeah, if you'd like to explore the altitude sickness option, the climb I would recommend you read would be the Vignemale in 1838, because she really got sick in that one, and the height is not the same as Vignemale. Vignemale is I think the tallest peak in the Pyrenees, in that region at least.
How much was that? How high was the Vignemale? How high was that?
Amanda, do you have the data at hand?
I'll have a look.
Basically, Amanda will get back to you in a moment. She got really sick, but she blamed the boiled milk she drank and the sort of paste the guides in the Pyrenees made as food, like sort of like porridge or something of the sort. She blamed that for the sickness. So I sort of thought, okay, maybe she got sick for that or something. Didn't agree with her. But then I also thought about altitude sickness. So I can't really tell. Amanda added in the chat the size. Okay.
So the Vignemale is 3298 high.
The Pyrenees is lower. It's not such an altitude.
I think, because that's in the chat from Amanda there, 3298. So it wouldn't be altitude sickness a little bit. Yeah, I swear it's your constitution for it, really. I climbed something this high in Switzerland when I was 14, and a couple of people were dropping like flies, and the rest of us were just like, ba-ba-da-da-da. So it all depends. If she was a bit prone to it, she probably wouldn't have liked mountaineering much. I don't know. All supposition. I have no research for my basis.
Yeah, sometimes it's a bit opinion based. So I think we are almost at time. So Amanda, would you like to take Livia's question about the pencil from Ben Nevis? What's the deal about the pencil?
Yeah, so she records in her journal on the way down from climbing Ben Nevis, having reached the summit, she's extremely thirsty and she loses her pencil. And for all we know, that pencil may still be there. So there is a reason to climb Ben Nevis, to go and find the pencil that belonged to Anne Lister. Good luck.
Good luck finding the pencil. So anything else?
I think that's it.
Okay, so if that's it, thank you everyone. We've enjoyed this. Please get in touch if you'd like, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, guys.